Picture this. You're holding your life in your hands, and it weighs exactly 2 ounces. Not metaphorically, literally. Every single arrow in your quiver represents the difference between your family eating tonight or going hungry, between surviving another brutal plains winter or watching your children slowly starve. This is the reality that Standing Wolf faced in the winter of 1742, when death stalked the Cheyenne camps along the Powder River like a hungry wolf. Now, when we think about survival in the American West, we usually picture cowboys and outlaws, maybe some frontier farmers scratching out a living. But long before any of that, centuries before, there was a completely different kind of survival happening out there. A survival so precise, so mathematically brutal, that it makes our modern struggles look like luxury problems. Standing Wolf was barely 20 summers old when he watched his father die in the snow, not from a bullet or a tomahawk from trying to retrieve arrows. Think about that for a moment. His father bled out beneath a wounded buffalo bull because those arrows were too precious to abandon. Each one represented 3 full days of intensive labor, 3 days of selecting the straightest willow shoots, singing the proper prayer songs over each shaft, carefully attaching eagle feathers that his mother had been saving since Standing Wolf's birth, and mounting those incredibly valuable iron points that could only be acquired through dangerous trading journeys that might cost a man his life. Here's where the mathematics get truly staggering. A skilled arrow maker, and we're talking about someone who'd been perfecting this craft for decades, could produce exactly 4 arrows in a single day. 4. Meanwhile, a single buffalo hunt consumed 40 arrows. You see the problem here. The arithmetic of survival was absolutely merciless. Standing Wolf counted 23 arrows in his quiver that terrible winter night. 23 chances to keep his family alive. When those were gone, and in the brutal calculus of Plains Indian life, they would be gone soon, his family would starve. It's that simple and that horrifying. But let's zoom out and really understand the scale of this crisis. Standing Wolf's band consisted of about 200 people. To maintain even basic hunting capacity, just the minimum needed to avoid starvation, they needed 60 hunters working full-time on arrow production. 60 men, doing nothing but making arrows, just to keep pace with consumption. That's 30% of their entire population dedicated to ammunition manufacturing. And that's not counting the support network. Women and children spent entire seasons, months and months, gathering the raw materials. They needed the right wood, which meant knowing exactly which trees produced the straightest grain. They needed sinew from specific tendons, not just any animal sinew. They needed tree resin mixed with charcoal in precise proportions to create adhesive that would hold under the stress of impact. This was advanced manufacturing, folks. This was a supply chain that would make a modern logistics expert weep. The geopolitics of arrow making were just as brutal as the economics. The Crow and Blackfoot peoples dominated the best hunting grounds, specifically because they controlled the cedar groves that produced superior arrow shafts. Think about that. Entire tribal territories were essentially defined by access to raw materials for ammunition. Standing Wolf had personally witnessed proud warriors, men who had counted coup against enemy war parties, reduced to begging for arrows. He'd watched his own uncle trade his finest warhorse, an animal worth perhaps 50 arrows in labor, for a bundle of 30 arrows. During the previous summer's clash with the Arikara, Standing Wolf learned another terrible lesson about the mathematics of warfare. Half the Cheyenne casualties came, not from enemy arrows or war clubs, but from warriors rushing into danger to retrieve spent ammunition. Young men dying not in glorious combat, but scrambling in the dirt for pieces of wood and metal that represented weeks of their lives. That night, as his mother sang his father's death song and the winter wind howled through the lodgepoles, Standing Wolf made a vow that must have seemed completely impossible to anyone listening. He would find a way to make arrows last longer. He would break the terrible arithmetic that kept his people forever balanced on the razor's edge between survival and starvation. His grandmother, the keeper of the old stories and the old wisdom, must have seen something in his eyes that night. She was ancient by Plains Indian standards, maybe 60 winters, and had lived through the time before horses, when survival was even more precarious. She leaned close to her grandson and whispered words that would echo in his mind for months to come. The answers live in watching. Sky, water, and wind teach those who truly see. Standing Wolf didn't know it yet, but he was about to embark on a journey that would fundamentally transform Plains Indian civilization. He was going to solve a problem that had plagued his people for generations. But the solution wouldn't come from war, medicine, or spirit visions, or ancient traditions. It would come from something much more dangerous and much more powerful. Innovation, born from absolute desperation. What Standing Wolf discovered in the mountains that spring would change everything, not just for the Cheyenne, but for every tribe across the Great Plains. His innovation would extend the golden age of Plains Indian culture by decades, would shift the balance of power in ways that would echo all the way to the Little Bighorn and beyond. But first, he had to survive the winter. And to do that, he needed to learn to see the world in a completely different way. Spring came to the Bighorn Mountains in 1743, and with it came Standing Wolf. But this wasn't your typical vision quest. No, what Standing Wolf carried up those sacred peaks would have puzzled any traditional Cheyenne elder. While other young men sought spirit animals and war medicine, Standing Wolf hauled hundreds of broken arrows, every shattered shaft, every split point, every failed piece of ammunition he could collect from old battle sites and hunting grounds. Think about the dedication here. This young man spent an entire winter gathering the debris of his people's survival struggles, broken arrows that represented thousands of hours of lost labor, dreams literally shattered against bone and stone. Most people would see garbage. Standing Wolf saw data. For 40 days, and when I say 40 days, I mean 40 days of methodical, obsessive study. He examined each break, each splinter, each point of failure. This wasn't mystical contemplation. Folks, this was engineering. Standing Wolf was conducting what we'd recognize today as failure analysis, except he was doing it with Stone Age technology and a brain trained by generations of survival expertise. What he discovered was fascinating. The shaft usually cracked just behind the point where it struck bone. The stress concentration was predictable. Or arrows would split along the grain when they hit at an angle, the wood fibers separating like pages in a wet book. Every failure told a story about physics, about materials, about the fundamental limitations of their technology. Now here's where Standing Wolf's genius really shows. He remembered his sister's loom back at camp. Picture this: he's sitting on a mountain peak, surrounded by broken arrows, and he's thinking about weaving. Specifically, he remembered how his sister guided threads through grooves that protected them from breaking under tension. The grooves distributed stress, kept the individual fibers from bearing the full load, and this is the moment that changes everything. He remembered watching water flow down the same channels in rock, wearing them smooth over countless seasons but never breaking through. The rock channeled and guided the water's force, absorbed and distributed it instead of fighting it directly. The solution crystallized in his mind with startling clarity. What if he could carve a precise channel along his bow? What if he could cushion that channel with specially prepared sinew that would flex like his sister's weaving? He could guide the arrow's flight while distributing the impact force across the entire shaft, instead of concentrating it at a single failure point. But understanding the theory and making it work, those are two completely different challenges. Standing Wolf's first prototype was an absolute disaster. The groove was too shallow, barely affecting the arrow's behavior. The second attempt split his bow completely, weeks of work destroyed in a single test shot. Traditional Cheyenne bowmaking wisdom said you never, ever modified the basic design. These bows represented centuries of accumulated knowledge. Who was he to think he could improve on that? This is where his sister becomes crucial to the story. When Standing Wolf returned to camp with his broken bows and radical ideas, most people thought he'd lost his mind on the mountain. But his sister understood tension and flexibility from years of weaving work. She helped him refine the third design, explaining how different materials responded to stress, how to prepare sinew so it would cushion rather than constrain. That third prototype, carefully crafted with his sister's expertise, successfully fired the same arrow 20 times into a practice target. 20 times. The same piece of wood and metal that should have been lost or broken after a single shot. The implications were staggering. But Standing Wolf hadn't anticipated the human cost of innovation. The resistance came immediately, and it came hard. Gray Elk, the band's master arrow maker, was furious. This wasn't just professional jealousy, though there was certainly that this was a fundamental challenge to spiritual beliefs. Each arrow carries its own destiny. Gray Elk thundered at the council fire, his voice carrying the authority of 40 years of craftsmanship. To force an arrow to fly again and again breaks the sacred covenant between hunter and prey. Think about what Gray Elk was really saying here. In traditional Cheyenne philosophy, each arrow was a prayer, a offering, a piece of the hunter's spirit sent forth into the world. The idea that you could mechanically retrieve and reuse that spiritual energy was, from his perspective, not just wrong but blasphemous. The young warriors were even crueler. They started calling Standing Wolf Broken Arrow, suggesting he was too poor and too lazy to make proper ammunition like a real man. In a culture where prowess with traditional weapons defined your entire social status, this mockery was devastating. Standing Wolf found himself increasingly isolated, his innovation dismissed as the desperate scheme of someone who couldn't master the real skills that mattered. But here's the thing about survival pressure. It has a way of cutting through cultural resistance like a hot knife through buffalo fat. Standing Wolf's cousin, Red Sky, had lost 2 brothers retrieving arrows in battle the previous summer. While everyone else was debating spiritual purity and traditional methods, Red Sky was thinking about dead siblings and grieving mothers. So Red Sky secretly tested the device. He took Standing Wolf's modified bow on a rabbit hunt, telling no one what he was really doing. When he successfully used 5 arrows to bring down 7 rabbits, firing, retrieving, and firing again, word began to spread through the camp like smoke from a signal fire. 7 rabbits with 5 arrows. In the brutal mathematics of Plains Indian survival, that equation changed everything. Suddenly, Standing Wolf wasn't just some crazy young man with weird ideas. He was someone who had fundamentally altered the relationship between effort and outcome, between resources and results. The autumn hunt of 1743 was approaching, and everyone knew it would be the real test. Rabbits were one thing, but could this innovation work on the scale that actually mattered? Could it help them bring down the buffalo herds that meant the difference between life and death for 200 people? Standing Wolf was about to find out if his mountain revelation could survive contact with reality. The Battle of Ash Creek wasn't supposed to happen. In the summer of 1744, Standing Wolf's band was simply following the buffalo herds through what they considered their traditional hunting grounds. The Crow warriors who intercepted them, 200 strong, painted for war, riding the finest horses on the northern plains, had different ideas about whose territory this was. Now, let's be clear about what Standing Wolf's people were facing here. 73 Cheyenne warriors against 200 Crow. In normal circumstances, this would be a massacre waiting to happen. The Crow weren't just numerically superior, they were arguably the finest light cavalry in North America, masters of hit-and-run tactics that had been refined over generations of warfare. But 30 of those 73 Cheyenne warriors carried Standing Wolf's modified bows. 30 men who had spent the winter practicing with arrows that refused to die, learning to think about combat in completely new ways. They were about to rewrite the fundamental assumptions of Plains Indian warfare. The battle erupted at dawn as mist rose from Ash Creek like the breath of sleeping spirits. The Crow, following traditional tactics that had served them well for centuries, opened with a massive volley. Over 1,000 arrows darkened the summer sky, a sight that would have broken the spirit of any normal war party. The mathematical reality was simple. Each Cheyenne warrior was facing an average of 14 arrows in that first devastating salvo. The Cheyenne took cover behind rocks and fallen logs, waiting for the inevitable second volley that would finish them. Except, the second volley never came. The Crow warriors were scrambling to prepare new arrows from rapidly depleting quivers, following the same brutal mathematics that had governed Plains warfare for generations. That's when something unprecedented happened. Something that veteran warriors on both sides had never seen in decades of combat. While the Crow struggled to knock fresh arrows, Standing Wolf's warriors calmly rose from cover, walked into the killing ground, and began retrieving arrows from the earth and from their own shields. Then they fired those same arrows back. Picture the psychological impact of this moment. You're a Crow warrior, You've just launched what should have been a decisive attack, and suddenly your own arrows are flying back at you. Not similar arrows, the exact same arrows you just shot, recognizable by their distinctive fletching and points. It would be like watching the dead rise up to fight again. The turning point came when Standing Wolf himself performed what survivors would remember as the Seven Eagles flight. Using a single arrow, one piece of wood and metal, he wounded 7 different Crow warriors, retrieving the shaft each time from flesh or shield, checking its straightness, and firing it again. The arrow held true through 7 impacts, 7 flights, 7 strikes against enemy flesh and bone. Think about what the Crow warriors were experiencing. They're seeing this distinctive red-fletched arrow coming at them again and again, like some supernatural weapon that couldn't be stopped or destroyed. In a culture where spiritual power was considered as real and as dangerous as physical weapons, this was more than battlefield tactics. This was evidence of supernatural intervention. By noon, despite outnumbering the Cheyenne almost 3-1, the Crow began to retreat. Not a fighting withdrawal, a full retreat, abandoning the field and leaving behind enough arrows to supply Standing Wolf's band for 3 full seasons. 3 seasons worth of ammunition, representing thousands of hours of labor, just scattered across the battlefield like fallen leaves. But the real victory at Ash Creek wasn't measured in captured arrows or enemy casualties. It was measured in the complete transformation of how Plains Indian warfare would be conducted from that day forward. News of the battle spread through the trade networks like wildfire across dry grass. Within 1 moon cycle, delegations began arriving at Standing Wolf's camp. The Lakota sent representatives who called it the bow that makes arrows immortal. Think about that phrase for a moment. Immortal arrows. To people who had lived their entire lives under the tyranny of ammunition scarcity, this must have seemed like magic. The Comanche, those master horsemen of the southern plains, sent their finest horse trainers to learn the technique. They understood immediately that this innovation would let their raiding parties travel lighter and strike much further from home. No longer would they need pack horses loaded with arrows. They could carry minimal ammunition and multiply it through reuse. The Apache, masters of mountain warfare where resupply was often impossible, incorporated Standing Wolf's design into their guerrilla tactics. Suddenly, a small Apache war party could maintain pressure on enemy forces for weeks instead of days, firing and retrieving the same arrows until the shafts literally wore out from use. Each tribe adapted the basic design to their own bow styles and fighting techniques, but the fundamental advantage remained consistent across all variations. An 80% reduction in arrow loss. 80%. In the brutal mathematics of Plains Indian survival, that number represented a complete revolution in how warfare and hunting could be conducted. Military historians would later calculate that this single innovation extended Native American military resistance against European expansion by 2 full generations. Think about the implications of that. Battles that might have been decided by ammunition shortage could now be sustained indefinitely. War parties that once had to choose between engaging the enemy and conserving arrows could now do both. The transformation went beyond purely military applications. Hunting parties could pursue buffalo herds for weeks instead of days, no longer constrained by the weight of arrows or the fear of running out of ammunition far from home. The economic implications were staggering. Labor that had been devoted to constant arrow production could now be redirected to horse breeding, tool crafting, and food preservation. Standing Wolf had solved more than a technical problem. He had broken the chains of scarcity that had bound his people for generations, creating abundance from wisdom and innovation. But the true test of his achievement was still to come, as European firearms began their inexorable march westward across the continent. By 1778, Standing Wolf had become White Eagle, an elder whose single innovation had fundamentally reshaped Plains Indian civilization. The young man who once counted 23 arrows in his quiver now presided over the School of the Returning Arrow, drawing students from 19 different tribes across the Great Plains. This wasn't just technology transfer, this was the birth of an institution that would preserve and evolve his discovery for generations. Think about what White Eagle had accomplished in those 36 years. He hadn't just invented a better bow, he had created an entirely new philosophy of warfare and survival. Students came to learn not just the technical craft of arrow guidance and retrieval, but the underlying principles that made innovation possible. They learned that true strength came from wisdom, not just courage. That observation and adaptation could overcome traditional limitations. That sometimes the most profound changes came from questioning the most basic assumptions. The economic transformation was absolutely staggering. White Eagle's grandsons could maintain arrow supplies that would have required 5 men to produce using traditional methods. 5 men. That meant 4 men in every 5 were freed from ammunition production to pursue other essential activities. Tribes redirected 60% of their arrow-making labor to horse breeding, tool crafting, and food preservation. 60% of their manufacturing capacity suddenly available for other purposes. To put this in modern terms, imagine if someone invented a technology that reduced your fuel costs by 80% while making your car more reliable. Now, imagine that breakthrough spreading across an entire continent within a single generation. That's the scale of transformation we're talking about here. But White Eagle's greatest test wasn't against other tribes, it was against the relentless westward pressure of European firearms technology. As muskets and rifles spread across the frontier, many predicted the end of Native American military effectiveness. After all, how could bows and arrows compete with gunpowder weapons? The answer lay in rate of fire and logistical flexibility. A typical musket of the 1700s took 30 seconds to reload, ramming powder, wadding, and ball down the barrel, priming the pan, aiming, and firing. 30 seconds of vulnerability. A warrior using White Eagle's bow design could loose 12 aimed arrows in that same time period, retrieving and refiring arrows faster than soldiers could complete a single reload cycle. The Battle of Adobe Walls in 1864 provided the ultimate demonstration of this advantage. Comanche and Kiowa forces, using evolved versions of White Eagle's design, held off Texas Rangers despite being outgunned 3-1. The Rangers had superior firepower per shot, but the Native American forces had superior sustained firepower, raining arrows continuously while the Rangers struggled through their reload cycles. Military historians would later calculate that arrow conservation technology extended effective Native American military resistance by 2 full generations. 2 generations. That's the difference between surrender in 1840 and the final campaigns of the 1870s. White Eagle's innovation quite literally changed the timeline of American expansion. But perhaps even more importantly, the economic surplus created by his arrow technology allowed Plains Indian culture to flourish during what we now recognize as its golden age. The elaborate ceremonial life, the sophisticated horse culture, the complex trade, networks, all of this was built on the foundation of freed labor that White Eagle's innovation provided. White Eagle died in the winter of 1782, and his funeral was attended by representatives from every Plains tribe. Chiefs who had been enemies for generations stood together to honor the man whose wisdom had benefited them all. His modified bow design was burned with him, according to Cheyenne tradition, but thousands of copies lived on, each one a testament to the power of innovation born from necessity. The Smithsonian Institution would later estimate that White Eagle's innovation resulted in 3 million additional buffalo harvested over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries. 3 million. That represents an enormous increase in protein availability, in hide production, in the raw materials that sustained Plains Indian civilization. His technology prevented an estimated 10,000 warrior deaths from arrow retrieval attempts, keeping fathers alive, keeping experienced fighters in service, maintaining the military strength that defined tribal independence. When his great-granddaughter, Morning Star, carried one of his original arrows to the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1851, she told the American commissioners something that perfectly captured her ancestors' legacy. This arrow has flown 500 times and killed nothing but hunger. It represents the genius you seek to conquer. 500 flights from a single arrow. 500 times that one piece of willow and eagle feather and iron had carried prayers and purpose across the vast spaces of the American West. In a culture that saw spiritual significance in every aspect of the hunt, this wasn't just mechanical efficiency, It was proof that innovation and tradition could coexist, that wisdom could multiply blessings rather than diminish them. Today, if you examine a modern compound bow, you'll find principles that White Eagle discovered through patient observation and desperate necessity. The guided arrow rest, the force distribution systems, the careful balance between control and flexibility. These concepts trace their lineage directly back to that young Cheyenne warrior studying broken arrows in the Bighorn Mountains. But White Eagle's true legacy isn't technological, it's philosophical. He proved that survival and prosperity don't always require more resources. Sometimes they require better thinking. Sometimes the most profound solutions come not from working harder within existing limitations, but from questioning whether those limitations are really as fixed as they appear. In our modern world, where we face our own resource constraints and survival challenges, White Eagle's story offers a powerful reminder. Innovation born from necessity, guided by careful observation, tempered by wisdom, and shared generously with others. These principles turned scarcity into abundance for an entire civilization. The returning arrow became more than a weapon. It became a symbol of human ingenuity's power to transform the impossible into the inevitable, one carefully aimed shot at a time.